Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here with you. It's not the best way to give my talk on the Reformation, but it's the best we can do given certain circumstances. I'd like to thank your pastor, Father Baird. I'd like to thank Greg Kelly, who arranges all this as the religious director at Mount Carmel, so that in case you did come tonight thinking I was going to be alive, you get the next best thing, and that's me, not quite dead. But it does mean that I am here and hopefully will return again. What I'd like to do tonight is to tell the story of Luther, paralleling what I did several years ago, and that was something of the same, that I wanted to talk about Luther. But I didn't obviously exhaust the topic, and this is what I would like to do tonight. So we're going to look at Luther in perhaps a different way than people might look at him. There are obviously different ways to look at Luther. He was a man who filled a room. When he came into it, he was big and huge, and people simply gravitated to him because of his charismatic attitudes. And so we'll get to that first. A couple of years ago, I used to lead tours to Europe. And one of the tours I took was to Germany. And I led my little group to Wittenberg. I'm not too sure that they thought that should be part of the tour, but it was. And the Church of Wittenberg still exists as much as it was when Luther was there. The door of the church has the 95 Theses, which made him famous and which changed the world. They're in bronze now, not in paper. And he's buried there. So we shuffled into the Church of Wittenberg. People took their places in the pews, and lo and behold, here was Luther's tomb. I wasn't sure before I went that it was going to be there, but it was. Now, either Luther was very short, or they didn't get him all in his tomb, because the tomb is a very small area, probably about 5 feet, not 5 feet. That's an exaggeration. And in that period, there's a black marble. And I put my hand on Luther's grave. And then I asked the guy who was the guard, is it okay if I give a little talk here about Luther, holding on to Luther's grave? And he said, I don't think he knew English. So he said, go ahead. And so I was able to give a talk on Luther, holding on to Luther's monument, and telling people why I disagreed with Luther. So it was a funny experience that I'll always remember. I'm going to approach this talk this evening by asking you to use your imagination. I would like for you to go with me through the times of Luther and to see what his world was like, and perhaps discover some of the reasons he did what he did. He's probably been examined by more people, by psychiatrists and authors than you could possibly imagine, because he's such an interesting person, and we have so much of his writings and thinkings. After he died, someone put together all his talks, known as the Table Talks. And these comprise several volumes that I doubt that anyone's ever read, all of them. And so we know what he's thinking, what he's doing. And this is why I like to do this. Now, the reason we're doing this tonight is that 500 years ago, this very moment, Luther would have been pondering his next move. 1517, Halloween night, will be the moment when he nails his thesis onto the chapel doors. But tonight he's still thinking about what he's going to do. And so that's where we're going to start. So let's ring the doorbell of the monastery at Wittenberg. and ask if we can see Dr. Luther. And he would come out and be interviewed by what we'd like to know about him. We want to know something more about him. Why is he a star? Why are people in Germany excited about him? Is he a Donald Trump, or is he somebody quite different? We'll see if we can come up with that. So Dr. Luther answers the door, and we tell him we'd like to walk down the street of Wittenberg and talk to him and interview him. So he comes out. He's very gracious. He is wearing the habit of the Augustinian canons, or of the Austin Fathers, as they're sometimes called, because he is a priest of that order. And so perhaps we should begin with asking him a few questions as we walk. First of all, can you tell us when you were born? He said, of course I can. I'm born in 1483. It's not necessarily a good time to be born because of the Black Death, which has hovered over Europe for at least 100 years and perhaps more, and keeps coming back. People need to know why, and I'm among them. Why is it this God is sending us this terrible plague? Perhaps 1 out of 3 people in Europe died in the 14th and 15th centuries. It took Europe 500 years to recover its population. And so Martin is saying, well, I was born in 1483. It was the best I could do. His father was a copper miner, but he knew poverty. Being a copper miner cannot be much fun, but it provided a living for the family. Luther knew a strictness of his father. Typically, the father wanted to dominate Luther, and time after time in his writings and talks, you find that he feels that he was oppressed in his family life in his early days. And his father had decided what his career should be, and that was to be a lawyer, because being a lawyer gave him a white-collar job. It also meant that the status of the family would be enhanced. And so, unwillingly, Luther went off to study law. The courses of law were different, perhaps a bit more today than then, because canon law played a major role in what was studied. The canon law is the law of the church. And so people who wanted to study civil law took a different track when they went to the universities for study. Well, Luther went he had been born in Eisleben, which is a town about 150 miles south of Berlin, and he did very well. There's no doubt he was somewhat brilliant. But yet at the same time, he never wanted to deny his peasant origins. Throughout his life, he kept the kind of peasant view that you might have rather than the more sophisticated view. Luther would not have been comfortable at a cocktail party. He would have loved Oktoberfest with his beer. And this was more his status. He was a beer drinker, not a champagne drinker. And so he would point that out, and it would just go by without noting that he's never changed from not thinking himself to be the product of poor peasants, relatively speaking, but poor peasants who were on the rise. And so he goes to the school. Now the story gets more interesting is that one day he's at the university. It's about 1500. And he's riding his horse, something clergy and nobility could do. Peasants wouldn't have had enough money to do that. And there's a storm. And all around him, lightning bolts are raining down on the forest and on the town. And wherever the lightning happens to strike, completely arbitrary. So frightens Luther. And he was an emotional man, that he promised God that if I survive, if you'll let me live, then I will become a monk. Now, that's a dangerous statement to make a statement during a thunderstorm when you're scared to death. You wonder how much you have to abide by what was obviously an emotional reaction. So 15 days, however, after the storm and after his conversion, he joins the monastery. Much to his father's dismay, I'm sure his mother's dismay. I mean, if your children become monks, you really can't count on Social Security from them because they're just not going to be around. And so it was that Luther entered the monastery of the Augustinians, and that's why he's dressed in their particular habit, which is a black habit. There are still Augustinians around. And they are still feeling bad about all this, that one of their boys went wrong. But at the time, he became very popular. He was ordained within 2 years of becoming a monk. And that was a fast track. That means he's ordained in 1505. So he's in his early teens, late. And he makes this decision without perhaps thinking too much about it. But even at his first Mass, he began thinking of his unworthiness. And one of the things that Luther's works show us, that he was the kind of person who was very scrupulous. And he says that himself, no matter what I tried to do, I was a faithful monk. I kept all the rules. I did all the things. And yet I knew God was angry with me and that I was going to hell. And this, of course, influences him a great deal. If you have that pessimistic, scrupulous attitude, you're not going to be a hail fellow well met. You're going to be someone who lives and looks perhaps at the worst side of life rather than the better side of life. Well, he's a star. He is teaching at the university, which has been founded at Erfurt by his political lord, who was Duke Frederick of Saxony. The Duke has just founded this university, and he wants to draw on the talents of the people around him who are wealthy and who are knowledgeable and who can afford the manuscripts that you need to have a good university. So Erfurt soon became the primary university of Germany, which at that time was known as the Holy Roman Empire. And it's Luther who gets the appointment to be the chair of the theology department. And he is given the job of preaching on Sunday. He's given the job of prior of the monastery where the faculty live. He's given a lot of work that you'd say means he's overworked. It's not just a little bit of activity, but that part of the reason for his inability to deal with his own psychological problems is that he had too much to do. So we're going to ask him, interrupt him now, as he's telling us this about himself, to walk out the door and to walk down the main street of Wittenberg, which is not too hard to do because the town was only about 4,000 to 5,000 people. The towns in Europe in 1499 or 1516 were still very small affairs. The biggest was Paris, and it probably had around 60,000 people, so just a middle-sized city compared to today. So as we walk, I try to ask him some questions. I said, what's going on here in Wittenberg? And he said, well, it's a market day. And the world I live in depends on market days and the farmers from around to bring their produce to the town. They set up their stalls, and they begin to try to entice people. And one of the things that characterizes the town is it's noisy. You can't go anywhere without hearing people in fair days shouting out what they want to sell so that you'll be able to purchase something or perhaps sell something yourself. Now, generally, market days do not last all week, but even during the week, it's going to be noisy. The other thing, which you might guess, it's smelly. If you went into a medieval town, you knew what was coming up even before you got there because of the smell that reeked from the town, where it probably had little to no sanitation. So that when people had to relieve themselves, it required them to find a spot where perhaps they could have some privacy and have a go at it. As far as garbage was concerned, it was simply a question very often of throwing what's left out the window. So that as you walk on the street here with Martin, I have to be careful where I step. Otherwise, I might end up on the ground that somewhere I don't really want to be. For the most part, the people who live here in the town are considered to be privileged because the alternative was to work on a farm where you were a serf. And a serf meant that a little better than a slave. A serf was at the mercy of the master from the time they are born until the time they get married and until the person dies. So that the life of a serf was very difficult. They had to work from morning till night. And certainly there's a great deal of resentment of this within the serf population, because they also can look up from their fields where they're working till 8 at night, and they see the castle of the Lord, who is now dining and dancing and enjoying life while they are still out growing the crops that he has or needs in order to live the life of a nobleman. This was pretty much true throughout all of Europe, not just Germany, that the nobility lived apart in their castles. Only in Flanders and in northern Italy did the nobility live in towns. They liked to live outside the towns. And this meant that when they came into town, they were riding their horses. One of the privileges that the nobility and the clergy had was to be able to ride horses, while again a peasant would be forbidden to ride a horse, and for that matter, wouldn't have had enough money to buy a horse anyway. So because they were too expensive for them. So as we walk, we see a crowd of people coming, not speaking German, but speaking Czech. And I say to Luther, well, who are these people? And he says, well, they're Hussites. And I said, well, what's a Hussite? Well, a Hussite is somebody who's mad at the church, and the church is mad at them. It's named after a fellow named Jan Hus. And it goes back to the beginning of the 15th century, when Jan Hus, who was a preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel at the University of Prague, some of you may have been to the Castle of Hradčany in Prague, and there in the room you'll see the Bethlehem Chapel to this day. And this is where this is where Hus gave his talks, where he was very popular among the Czechs. And part of the reason for this is the university at Prague was divided between Germans and Czechs. And the Germans saw to it that they were the ones that got the privilege. They were the ones who got tenure. They were the ones who taught in class. Now remember, in the 15th century, if you're going to a university, you're going to have to know Latin, because all the texts that you're going to use are in Latin. Hus is going to preach in Latin. He's going to teach in Latin. If you want to have success in life, you'd better be prepared first to have the linguistic skills. One of my suggestions is that our Congress adopt the same rules. In Hungary, the nobility spoke Latin all the way down to 1848, and you couldn't be a member of the parliament unless you knew Latin. Let's ask the Congress to do something about it, that everybody knows Latin in Congress before they're allowed to serve. This would cut down on, I'm sure, the speeches, and perhaps add a note of sobriety to what generally is a good deal of absenteeism at Congress. Well, we ask a little bit more about Hus. What was his problem? And for Hus, not only was he mad at the fact the Germans got all the plums at the University of Prague, but also is very much concerned about what was being taught there. And one of the things he said is that the church has become too much an institution, too much concerned with the business of the day, too wealthy, that it owns too much property. Perhaps 1/3 of the land in the Czech world or the Bohemian world is owned by the church. The bishop dresses up all in ways that no one else could afford the kind of silks that he would wear in his outfit. So he says Huss was supposed to argue, especially the Eucharist must be received in bread and wine. Now, Huss had something going here, in my opinion. Jesus says, "Eat my body, drink my blood." But one of the things that had happened in the Western Church in the Middle Ages was that the clergy began reserving the precious blood to themselves, so not to the people. And so the people not only didn't receive the full amount of bread, the bread was unleavened, but they did not receive the Eucharist, the wine. And one could argue that Huss had something here when he says that the clergy must not reserve the Eucharist to themselves. They must also have the bread and the wine. Otherwise, it's not a complete Eucharist. So this title of these people are Utraquists, which literally means both and, that they are going to demand that. But as time goes on, other issues arise. You can't begin a Reformation and then think that everybody's going to be reformed in the same way. They're going to be reformed in different ways. And so it was with Huss. Now, people got mad at Huss, and happily at the time, for the bishops and the clergy and the Pope, there's a council going on in Constance, which is in Germany today, one of the great beautiful lakes. And the clergy are there in great numbers, bishops, people who are theologians, people who are hangers-on, one might say, people who very often brought their concubines with them to as they waited for the preaching, the teaching, and the trying to reach some sort of compromise. So the council went on way too long. But one of the things it did was to ask John Huss to come and explain himself. And so Huss gets a letter that says, "This is a safe conduct to Constance, written by the emperor, that will allow you to come to Constance and come home again, that you won't be persecuted as a heretic because you have the safe conduct." So Huss comes, and he's immediately questioned by the various theologians. How does he believe? And as he struggles with it for almost a year, they finally convict him that he is a heretic, that his belief that you must receive both bread and wine, the belief that salvation comes only when you have the complete Eucharist, that the clergy are not a separate class, that the idea of having a priestly people extends not just to the clergy but also to the people. And so the penalty for being a heretic is pretty bad. It's being burned at the stake, and that hurts. So Huss is taken out, and he is condemned to die by burning at the stake. And this is done. He is burned at the stake. Despite the safe conduct, he prefers simply to the people who convict him ignore it. And so one of the things in the back of Luther's mind when he's doing his thinking and his pondering is, will I be a John Huss? if the emperor compels me to come meet him in his castle, and the bishops and the theologians, and am I going to answer yes or no, or I'm going to say, I don't want to come. You come see me. And throughout his life, one of the things that he's being accused of and being troubled by is the church's theologians arguing that Luther is a second-grade Huss, that he believes the same things that Huss did, and he deserves the same penalty. Now, how is it that Luther didn't do it? Later on, we'll find out that he comes and is brought before what it looks like the council called by the emperor, called the at Worms in German, where the young emperor sounds Luther out. Now, Luther came to the Council of Worms. We were jumping ahead a bit, willing to admit that he had Huss's ideas, and that, of course, doomed him. And not too surprising, although, again, this is after 1516, he's spirited out of town by his friends, lives with a disguise in a castle of Wartburg. So did not venture forth for fear that indeed he would be convicted of heresy, and being convicted of heresy had this terrible penalty. He said, well, these people who follow Huss are still allowed to come into the town, still allowed to take advantage of the facilities. We don't ask too many questions about it, but they're dressed different, they speak different, and eventually, obviously, they are different. But they've managed to survive. Today, the Hussites have disappeared, obviously, if too many of them got convicted. But they lasted down till the First World War, that there were still some around. Because eventually they started an army. They figured it wasn't much fun being burned at the stake. So why not start an army and defend yourself? And so there were what were called the Hussite Wars throughout the 15th century as the emperor tried to suppress them. Some people think they were the inventors of the covered wagon defense out here in the West, that they would pull their wagons into a circle and put their guns inside of them, their soldiers, and then when the emperor attacked, they were covered on all sides with the covered wagons. Well, then we walk a little bit further, and we see people bringing merchandise into town that they have made. And I say to them, but look, over here, people are dealing with coins, not with stuff. And Luther said, yes. Guess who they are? They're the Jews. Christians cannot buy and sell anything at interest without being accused, if there's a loan, of usury. And usury was taken extremely seriously, that if one made a loan and charged interest, they were acting against God's will. So serious that if you were convicted of usury before a church court, you did not receive Christian burial. You were excluded from the communion of saints in purgatory because of your holding on to this. So what happened? People were very creative, you know. So the Jewish people, who were not bound by the laws of the church, decide to take up the job of money lending, which becomes very popular among them, and which allows them to make livings. Jews were not permitted to own real estate. They had to only own things that they could buy and sell among themselves, or they took up the job of lending. Now, the Christians found their way out of this by A, making their loans from Jews rather than from other Christians, and B, by simply charging more for the loan, that without calling it interest or calling it, some extra outside the way of amassing some kind of wealth. And one of the things that's true about 1516 that we're talking about that year and other years around it is there was a huge amount of new bullion coming into Europe. Because what's happened in 1492? Well, Columbus has discovered America, but later on leading to other amounts of people, but especially in Mexico, once Cortez comes on the scene, whole rooms were filled with gold and silver. Up until then, Europe had depended upon bullion from North Africa. Now, all of a sudden, there's this source of wealth that's coming into Europe, causing very inflated prices. Again, the nobility and the church were the ones who benefited from the amount of gold and silver that's coming into Europe. If you visit the cathedral in Sevilla, you can see the gold that came with Columbus, that came back with Columbus, as the reredos of the church. So if I say, well, how come the Jews look a little different? All of them wear the same kind of hat. Well, that's church law says that if you're a Jew, you must identify yourself. And so there is a conical hat that every Jewish man must wear. As far as Jewish women were concerned, they were best kept out of sight, both agreed to by their husbands and by the church itself. Sometimes this Star of David was used as well as the hat. And so I said, well, what about them? Well, he says, we try to just avoid them, and they try to avoid us. They deal with us because they have to. And very often they say the Jews are useful because the kings have run out of money. And the easiest things to do to fill the treasury was to make a law that all Jews must contribute an X amount of dollars to the king's treasury. And so for the monarchs, it was a good thing to have Jews around because you could always extort extra funds from them. And but they lived a pretty miserable life in ghettos, separated from the world, separated from various occupations. It's a wonder they survived. And yet, we think that at the time of Luther, perhaps 10% of the population was Jewish. But it took guts to be a Jew. And in 1492, again, Luther would have been aware of this, that Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews from Spain. And those who don't want to leave home have to go into Portugal and then later to the Netherlands. And finally, many of them come into Israel in our own time. But the Jew always depicted in literature and arts as someone who can't be trusted, someone who is a cheater. So Luther says, let's hurry by. But they say, well, how do you feel about the Jews? And Luther would say, I just can't understand it. Luther would perhaps go into a kind of a diatribe against how bad Jews really were. And much of his table talk is against Jews. He said, why is it they don't recognize Jesus as Savior? Why is it they keep their own way, their own rules? Why is it they don't want to contribute to the life of the Christian church? So Luther's diatribes against Jews are somewhat embarrassing today to Lutheran church people because it shows Luther not at his best, but at someone who is quite intolerant. Well, let's keep on going down the street. We've visited the Hussites. We've seen the people who are the Jews. Are there any other people? Yeah, there are some people that are even stranger looking. They're the gypsies. They're not very many, but they're there, and they cause people to be afraid. What are they up to? And once again, much like the Jews, the gypsies suffered discrimination. Very often, one finds that gypsies of Europe today are in the millions, believe it or not, still the object of intolerance. So much so that from my point of view, in my own life, my own travels, I've never seen violence except one time when I was in Greece. And the gypsies came into town. And rather than welcome them because they're needed for the olive harvest, people picked up stones and began throwing them at the people. So the same thing has a long history. The idea that Jews, gypsies, outsiders, Hussites, all of these people are outside the Christian tradition, and Luther says we're against that. So I said, well, Mr. Luther, or Dr. Luther, what I'm interested in now is to hearing more about your teaching in the university. Tell me about that. Tell me why you think the church is not doing the right thing in 1516. Well, Luther says, I don't know exactly where to begin. But let me begin with the 13th century. In that sense, Luther is probably like historians. They like to begin with Adam and Eve and then move on to their subject. He said the problems begin, from my point of view, in the 13th century. Up until 1250, the period from Charlemagne in the 9th century until the coming of the Renaissance. So he said, what happened in the 13th century? Up until 1250, things were going well. But then comes 1250 and things begin to change. Some good, some bad. But as far as religion was concerned, it began to change because the people who began to be the teachers in the church were no longer the bishops. They were rather the people who were the faculty at the university, or they were the canon lawyers who manned the church courts. The bishops gave over their teaching authority to people who were, by nature, their job required to be argumentative, to be difficult, to be out of touch with the population as a whole. People just didn't know how much they were interested in religion and how much they were interested, as frankly, in teachers today in the faculties, spend a good deal of time worrying about promotion and tenure. That wasn't too surprising. And thus, Luther said, they got off the track, and the track was scholasticism. Thomas Aquinas lived in 1250, and he brought with him the knowledge of Aristotle, which had been lost up until the 13th century to Western Europeans. It was still known in the eastern part of the empire, but Aristotle, only one work of Aristotle was known in 1200 in the West. And so there simply weren't the texts. And the place where the thinking went on was actually Spain, where there was a very rich mixture of Christians, Muslims, and Jews to work on the question of what are interesting. And what the question that Aristotle was being asked, Luther would say, was what is real? What is real? How do you know something is real from something that isn't real? What is it this is all about? And so the people like Aquinas and Aristotle before him came up with the notion of the universal. Now today we don't talk much about that, but in the 13th, this was the issue of the day. In order for something to be real, does it have to have some kind of materiality or spirituality that combines the substance with the accidents? And thus Thomas Aquinas would say, this is how we understand the Eucharist. Jesus is present in substance, not in accidents. That there is going to be the accidents of bread, of whiteness, roundness, taste, these things remain. But the substance of the bread is changed. And Luther would say, but he's wrong. He's wrong about that. We don't need that kind of universal. that's found. Let's be content with the fact that Jesus is in the Eucharist. Let's leave it at that. That's the way our Eastern Christian brothers and sisters leave it. They don't go into where the Eucharist or how the Eucharist is going to be confected, but rather it is, and leave it at that. The other thing which bothered Luther is that the kind of thing that happened in the Eucharist was for people to quit going to the Eucharist. It was felt that penance had to be had right before the Eucharist was used, and this discouraged people from going to the communion because they didn't want to fast. They didn't want to go to confession. So they were somewhat upset about that. And other things about scholasticism was the famous idea of syllogism, which a syllogism is 3 parts. All men are human. John is a man. John is human. You arrive at truth through contrasting a positive statement, then break it down into a more reasonable statement, and then find the truth when you've gone from the thinking about all men being human and that John is a man. So he said, what we want to do is get back to St. Augustine, that the Latin Church should be dependent upon the theology of this great master of theology that appeared in the 4th and 5th century in North Africa. Again, I've had a chance to visit the places very often where, again, Augustine would have taught. And he was a remarkable man. I think second, I put him second, a lot of people would put him first, of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas did 18 folio volumes. He was left-handed, so he had to stand up while he wrote. So he stands up and he's writing. His penmanship is impossible. Again, having seen some of the manuscripts he did. Now, I don't think any of Augustine's originals are left. They are copies of what Augustine had to say, because he's living 1,000 years before, and it's much easier to be destroyed. So he said, let's go back to Augustine. Let's see what Augustine says about things. Let's get rid of scholasticism. He says, I hope it's going down to hell. That was his term. And Luther was not a man of precise language that would have been popular among educated people. He talked as a peasant. He emoted as a peasant. And people kind of enjoyed that in him. You get a bit of that populism in our present day election, that people enjoy seeing somebody get excited and nervous. They don't always like the academic approach to things. So we say, okay, what are you teaching? He said, I'm teaching on the Psalms. I'm teaching on St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. I'm teaching on St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And I find this a great challenge. Again, remember that the only Bible that could be used by Luther was the Vulgate. Now, the Vulgate was was translated by St. Jerome back in the end of the 4th century. One of the reasons why, obviously, peasants never read the Bible, which sometimes is looked upon as a great mistake with the church, is they didn't know Latin. Unless you knew Latin, there wasn't much point in doing it. And so it was that Luther would have, and his students would have used the Latin text. They would have used copies of the Vulgate. And even that, the copies are very often difficult to read, extremely difficult to read for me, because they just, the handwriting is beyond what it is today. At any rate, he would have said, okay, this is what we need to know from the Psalms. This is what we need to know from the epistles. And he comes across the first chapter in the Epistle to the Romans. And again, it's translated different ways even today by Lutherans, by Catholics, by anybody. The just man is justified through faith. Or, the righteous man is made righteous by faith. Now, whether it's justification by righteousness, it means that your salvation is dependent upon God's action in you. Are you going to be righteous? It's because God makes you righteous. Is it going to be justification? Is it because you are going to be justified by the act of God? And Luther said, I've got compatriots over there who are teaching that God predestines everyone to salvation, or not to salvation, but somehow or other, people are often and are required to have free will. How do you combine predestination with free will? And I tell you tonight, it's still not solved. We still have a problem trying to understand how you can merge the two. Because if indeed I'm predestined, then what's life all about except acting through a play? Shakespeare was close to the truth. If, on the other hand, it's our free will, then are we not always in danger of sinfulness? And this was Luther's thought, that nearly the whole human race is going to be condemned to hell because they've used their free will in the wrong way, because they haven't gone to confession as often as they should. They haven't received the Eucharist as often as they should. He said, we've been arguing this for 200 years. And if he were here tonight, he could add 500 more. How is it that you can have God being almighty at the same time holding back from the evil that's in the world? Why doesn't God save the child that runs out in front of a car? And to say it's God's will seems blasphemous. How could God rejoice in the death of anything, of anybody? Does God really like to see the death penalty? I doubt it. So it is with Luther is trying to grapple with the Eucharist. He's trying to deal with the problems that are brought up by predestination, and he's got problems with other things. Now, the other things are the accretion of the authority of the Pope to amass almost all decision-making, because, indeed, the popes prior, let's say, the 500 years to Luther, have been a mixed bunch, not altogether saintly. The bottom was probably reached in the 9th century, but things had still not improved completely by the time we reached the 16th. The problem, of course, to begin with, is how do you elect a pope? Today we have cardinals who do that sort of thing. But in Luther's day, there were also cardinals, but generally speaking, they represented their kings. They were considered more as diplomats than they were as churchmen. And thus, when the Pope wants something done, he sends one or two of them to England. Cardinal Wolsey was Henry VIII's diplomat. He was his foreign minister. And being a part of the church was only incidental. And so Luther has to worry, or does worry, about the fact that the leadership of the church has fallen into hands unworthy of the church. It's fallen into the hands of men who come from powerful families, who can afford the cost of being a cardinal, or even the cost of being a bishop. Because one of the ways you became a bishop was to make sure you paid for it. You sent the money to Rome, and in return you would receive a degree that tells you that you are now a bishop. Well, people who were ambitious, and Luther's own bishop was one of them, didn't think this was the way to go. The bishop of Luther's was the Bishop of Brandenburg, and his name was Albert of Hohenzollern. And Albert was 27 years old, but he already had 3 bishoprics. He gathered bishoprics. So he was not, the most important one was the Archbishop of Mainz. So again, we have visited there, and you can still see the place, the cathedral at Mainz, where the cardinal, not a cardinal, but an archbishop functioned. Now, Luther was mad because he doesn't really care about being a bishop. He cares about amassing territory and getting the revenue that comes from that territory. And so what does Albert of Hohenzollern do to get the money to be a bishop? He borrows it. He borrows it from the people who were known as the Fugers. And they were the banking family of Augsburg. And when, indeed, Luther is going to have to deal with the indulgence, a Fugger sat on the same platform as the man who has the indulgence certificates. So it looked bad. But there was the slogan, as soon as the coin falls into hell, the soul comes out. So again, would you let Uncle John fry in hell, or I suppose more accurately purgatory, if you could get him out by making a donation? Well, Albert of Hohenzollern didn't like the idea of the indulgence that we're going to talk about next. And this is what's going to bother Luther next, because it took money out of his pocket that then went to Rome. Okay, so what about an indulgence? What is an indulgence? Well, as it sounds, it's something that allows something to be changed a bit. Let me give an example. You're brought into traffic court, and the judge says you've got to take your license away for 30 days. And you say to the judge, but please, I got to make a living. My family has to eat. So the judge says, okay, I'll commute your sentence to 1 day. And that's what an indulgence does. Indulgence does not forgive sins. Only the sacrament of penance forgives sins. What the indulgence does is to take away the penance that was required in the early church if you wanted to go to confession. In the early church, confession was public. So if you were a notorious sinner, you were brought before the congregation, you confessed, and you went your way. But in the 7th and 8th century, the Irish monks, who were monks. Well, let's discuss indeed what is an indulgence. Constantly you read that Luther is upset about the buying and selling of indulgences. But what is an indulgence? Why is it worth buying? Well, the indulgence is the punishment that people received in the early church for committing a sin. Generally, confession went before by having you confess your sins publicly, before the bishop preferably, and there he would assign that you must, certain things, good works that you must do. Among the most severe were pilgrimage. You would say you have to go to Jerusalem. Well, that's a long way. It might be to fast on bread and water for a year, and that too was pretty tough. And so what happens is there develops, in the Western Church alone, interestingly enough, no Eastern Christians don't have indulgences. They're in more line with Luther, that the indulgence has to be given to them in ways that they can handle it. And they could handle it in one way by donations. And right now there's a great need for money in Rome, because the Pope has decided that he's going to tear down the old St. Peter's and build a new one that'll be the largest building in Christendom. And the Pope at the time is Leo X. He's a Medici, and his tastes were pretty high. They certainly, bringing Luther together with Leo would have been an interesting contrast. And in order to raise some money for his building program, Leo bargained with Albert of Hohenzollern, Luther's bishop, that he'll get a cut. He bargains with the people who are his civil officials that they'll get a cut. And so that by the time the money got to Rome, there was a little of it left, because as it passed from hand to hand, it lost some of its value as people put a little bit more into their pockets. And so it is that it had a bad idea. Now, an indulgence does not free people from purgatory in the sense that it's a spiritual thing. Indulgences are concerned with this world. An indulgence is given so that you don't have to do the public penance that you would have had to do if you lived in the ancient world and in a different time of Christian faith. Thus it is that Luther is going to attack the indulgence system as being corrupt. A, too much of the money doesn't get where it's supposed to go. B, people are making a living from squandering the money that they get. And this it bothers him at all. And then he says, but of all things, how come the Pope has all these indulgences? If he's got all these indulgences, why doesn't he give them out? Why shouldn't they be free? If you're going to get an indulgence, why say you have to pay 50 ducats to get an indulgence certificate? Because the other point I want to make is the indulgence is not something that you really buy. You can't buy and sell something that's spiritual. You can try it. I can try to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, and that you can buy it. But if I try to sell you the angel that's my guardian angel, that's pretty hard to do because we don't know that much about it. And so it is with Luther's own complaints. They were somewhat legitimate, but he did argue, and did the Lutherans later, that indulgences must be just no longer used in the church because they were too much open to corruption. It looked like, and a lot of uneducated people thought they forgave sins. And it was a lot easier to make a donation to the building of St. Peter's than it was having the money to donate. And so it was that Luther became very much intrigued by indulgences, and 500 years next year on Halloween night, we will commemorate his attack on indulgences in what are known as the 95 Theses. But Luther's already thinking about that. He's already saying you can't have indulgences. Then he said, but let's go a little bit further. Let's get rid of everything unless it's in the Bible. Well, there's been almost 1,000 years from Jesus to Luther. And Luther wants to reject everything in between. One of the things that the Pope says when he hears about Luther is here's one monk in Christendom saying he knows better than 1,000 scholars of Christendom. Where does he get such pride that he would think that he can handle it when nobody else has noticed it? And what is it that they've noticed? Luther has added a word to the scripture. Again, one of the things that will come after Luther's day in his history, in his biography, is his translation of the German Bible. And Luther was quite adept at that. He was very good. Up until then, there were Bibles in German. Luther was not the first to write a German Bible or translate a German Bible, but his was so just better than the others that today it's universally used in the Lutheran communities. So using the Bible only meant that he had to look for something else, and he finds that in actually editing the Bible. And after he translates Romans, which I've already mentioned, which he's lecturing on, he adds a word. The just man is justified through faith, and Luther adds alone. So everything else is thrown out the window. Pilgrimage, attending Mass, receiving the sacraments. Luther kept baptism and he kept the Eucharist. But otherwise, he says, I find no warrant for this in the Scripture. Out it goes. Now, in many ways, that was, again, too bad. But at the same time, one could argue that too much of the church had become mired in superstition and in gardens of too many people thought witches existed. And one of the people that we might see in our walk downtown is some woman in stocks, and we might say, well, what did she do? And we would say, well, she's a witch. She seduces people, and we can't let her go free. And that the penalty for being a witch is, again, various, sometimes drowning, sometimes fire, like being a heretic. And witches were still a part of the medieval scheme until the 18th century. The last witch, as we know, will take place much after most of the world had decided that witches were in people's minds, not in their actuality. So Luther's going to say, well, we've got to deal with everything except the Bible. And we want everybody to learn to read the Bible. And we want people to recognize that that alone is the Word of God. And that suffices. Now, Luther did not want to get rid of the Mass. He wanted, and did believe, that the Eucharist, the bread of the Eucharist, was the true body and blood of Christ. And when he meets the Calvinists who arrive on the scene a generation later, the one thing that Luther says when he meets with them is to say, but it says, this is my body. It doesn't say it represents my body. It doesn't say it's something else. So this gives me a chance to say to Luther, well, what about worship? What's going on? And he said, well, there's a big difference between city clergy and country clergy. The city clergy are, for the most part, well educated. It's a myth to say that priests were uneducated. Over half the priests who served in towns were university graduates. The other half weren't. But the rural clergy were, for the most part, illiterate, or if not illiterate, bordering on illiterate. Very often they memorized the Mass so that they could offer Mass, but they weren't really knowing, since they didn't speak Latin, what they were saying. There was no organized way to train a priest. And this meant that there were lots of people, very often for the country clergy, you simply, if you wanted to be a priest, you moved in with somebody who was a priest to learn how to do things, or you moved in with a relative who was a priest. If you had an uncle who was a priest, you could move in with him until you, in 2 or 3 years, become a priest. And there were too many clergy. I don't know what is too many, but it's, again, estimated that 1 person in 20 was in the clergy. So today we complain about a shortage, but there was no shortage at the time of the Reformation. There was plenty. So let's see. Luther said, well, so what about the parish? Well, he said, well, let's look into this parish church and see what's going on. Well, for one thing, we've got the priest at the altar, but he's not doing anything. And why? Because he's waiting for a stipend. And he's waiting for somebody to come up and give him some money, and then he'll start. But after the Mass is over, what happens? He waits again. See if somebody else won't come up and give him some stipends. So you had people who were Mass priests who made a living through saying Mass. There were people who were called beadsmen who made a living through saying the rosary with the beads. So he said that's not the proper way. Now, for the most part, now there are no pews in the church. You either stood all through the service, or, on the other hand, some places, you knelt all the way through the church. There was, and this will be a problem for some people, there were no sermons. At 1500, 1516, the parish priest would not have been educated enough to give a sermon. So the people, again, where was their sermon? The stained glass windows. That was their Bible. And this was what was used to educate somebody in the Christian faith, is to show them the pictures on the wall and the statues of the saints. And this was something that made them feel like they were close to God. It's interesting that Luther wanted, and the Lutheran Church wanted to get rid of everything that wasn't in the Bible, and yet the Bible of the illiterate person is a stained glass window. So I say, well, that's kind of hard on people. I notice that not many people, are active in participating. For the most part, they're passive. That those who do make a living, it's a hard way to do it, and not necessarily a good way to do it. There was a great devotion to the Eucharist, not to the Mass itself, but to the Eucharist itself. And so, for many people, seeing the priest elevate the host, something that began in the 13th century, is more important than anything else. And thus we have in England a parishioner yelling out, "Heave it up, Sir John, I can't see it." And so you were asked to heave up the Eucharist, the consecrated bread, so that people could see it, not to receive it. And thus there were people who went from one church to another, just looking for the moment of the elevation of the host, and not receiving the Eucharist, but looking at the host. And the host was used, again, for many other. It was felt that if you put the host on your head, or the Gospel of John especially, with the host, that would cure you. And this was one other reason why people felt the way they did about the Eucharist. The laity did not receive in the West the wine, the consecrated wine, although in Eastern Christianity, people still always use and receive both in bread and wine. They feel the complete Eucharist. So we say, well, that's pretty good, Martin. What are you teaching? Is there anything different? He said, well, I've taught nearly everything that you need to know. We've walked all our way downtown. My monastery is not a bad place. The people who are there are diligent in keeping their offices, but we hear problems of what's going on in Rome. Now he said, did you know that I went to Rome? I said, no, I didn't know that. Well, yes, I said, I did. I went, my order sent me to Rome, the Augustinians, to argue with some Dominicans who were taking Augustinian property. And when I went to Rome, I really found it something of a shock that the priests there have these multiple masses, that too many people are interested in getting rich through their church office, and that was the one thing that concerned them. And so it is, he said, I don't like this. The church needs to be kind of swept out, and we'll start over with the Bible and the Bible alone, and then life will go a lot better for the church and people in the church. So there was a great gap all over Europe. There was a pessimistic period. Luther was very much upset, as was St. Augustine, with original sin. He felt that had ruined everything. And that, again, when thinking about how one receives salvation, there was the feeling you had to be in the church. So the Latin phrase, nullus salus extra ecclesia, no salvation outside the church. And to be in the church, you had to be baptized. And thus Luther was very strong on the fact that that people should continue to be baptized. What he didn't and will not recognize is that he's got a problem himself with trying to be a good monk, a good preacher. And indeed, the preaching was done. I neglected to point out that even though the parish priest didn't lecture, the religious order priest did the preaching. So if you went to a convent or a monastery, you would listen to the priest who is a religious, a Franciscan, a Dominican especially, and his own order, the Augustinians or Carmelites. In fact, the Carmelites were organized as preachers as well as the others. Well, you say there are some things to do and things not to do. But you say, I need help. How come I'm not being arrested? I asked Luther, what's wrong? How come you get away with it? He says, because I have the support of my Duke. I live in Saxony, and the Duke of Saxony won't let the emperor get in my way. He says to the emperor, stay out of Saxony. I'll take care of Luther. And that meant, even though he himself never became a Lutheran, Frederick of Saxony supported Luther, protected him, and later when he goes into disguise, he still wears the habit, the Augustinian habit, but by this time, that is by the the decade of 1517, he's decided that if you can't find it in the Bible, and thus priestly celibacy is thrown out. And he marries a former nun as his wife, and they have quite a happy family for the rest of his life. He seems to have lived the life of a country squire, surrounded by people who feel that he has the truth. And this table talk that I mentioned earlier, he also did a lot in building up on a catechism. I think of the two great works of Luther, or two or three for that matter, are the Greater and the Lesser Catechism, where he brought together his ideas. And he's also encouraged the lay people to act. He encouraged the dukes and the princes of Germany. They are the ones who have to purify the church, because he figures the church probably won't purify itself with people like Julius II, the warrior pope, who was pope during Luther's own day. He would generally walk around wearing armor because he was a captain in the army. Certainly kind of strange for a pope to do. Then we've got Julius is the one who orders St. Peter's built, so we can give him credit for that. He's the one that brought Michelangelo, ordered the Sistine Chapel to be decorated. So we owe Julius something, but he was a grumpy old man. The next Pope, Leo X, was, as I say, a Medici with Medici taste. So, Martin, I've appreciated the interview that I've had with you. We've met some interesting people along the way. I understand what your life is like, how the church is like. I agree with you that it needed some cleaning up, but it had the resources to clean itself up internally, in my opinion. It was not an impossible task. One could argue that Vatican II did something of the same. It cleaned up some things that needed to be done. But the question always remains, is the Catholic Church the true church? And those of us who aren't Lutherans, not Jews, not Hussites, we have to say, and we have to believe in our creeds, we have to believe in the Bible, we have to believe in 1,000 years of tradition that enables us to be good people, and we trust the day will come when perhaps we'll find out how predestination And free will worked in our lives, and we can rejoice about that. And so I'm glad to say goodbye. I won't bother you anymore, and you can continue to hopefully see that Lutherans and Catholics are pretty much on the same page today, and that the old issues have pretty well faded. And the best example, the Pope is going to Sweden next year and visit with the Lutherans to commemorate the Reformation. He's not going to celebrate it. That would be too much. We don't celebrate. We commemorate. We remember. And next year on Halloween night, 1570 and 19, that's kind of all. I'm run out of ideas. So next year, can we do that over? Next year, at this time on Halloween night, we'll remember that that's the moment to commemorate Luther's theses. Thank you for your kind attention. I'll hand this back to Greg Kelly.